So we're going to take medieval Japan through becoming an imperial power in this section. Um, Japan had really unified under the threat of Mongol invasion. Um, Traditionally, Japan had been a feudalistic society with local warlords or shoguns uh, basically running the entire country. And with the threat of Mongol invasion, which ended really in the worst naval disaster in history with 100,000 Mongols dying, the Japanese recognized their need for unification. Um, so they built up this very strong feudalistic society based instead around the Catholic Church, around Buddhist monasteries in Japan. Um, the Fujiwara clan is going to dominate for a long, long time. And so the daimyos, they gain power. These are even more local kind of warlords. You could really think of it as a feudalistic samurai or knights and and then you have lords and shoguns are the kings kind of thing. Um, by 1630, you have the Tokugawa shogunate, which is ruled by shogun in power. So essentially, a warlord or a king is ruling the entire country, centralizes the power, stabilizes the economy, which is very, very agrarian, very much a feudalistic European type government. And they become very hostile towards outsiders. By 1638, they're going to ban Westerners entirely from entering Japan, and much like China, they enter a period of isolation. Um, with really their only contact being through Korea, which is relatively close. The Japanese are going to watch very nervously as China is humiliated in the 19th century, in the Opium War in particular, and some of the other things we've talked about. And so Japan wonders if it would suffer a similar fate, and they very much are aware of that threat. And so into that, and we have across the Atlantic comes this guy, Matthew Perry, we're going to talk about in a second. So Japan spends 250 years in isolation due to this policy of isolationism, shakoku. But in July of 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry sails into Tokyo Bay in huge warships, steamships, and they're armed to the teeth. They're full of cannons and soldiers, and they're very modern and threatening. He basically hands the Japanese a letter from the U.S. President, Millard Fillmore, which is probably one of the greatest names ever, demanding that Japan open up and serve as a refueling station so that the U.S. could use it on the way to China. They also had the Hawaiian Islands by this point. So the Japanese sign, being incredibly fearful of what had happened to the Chinese. U.S. is granted, and this is kind of an unfair treaty, allow the Chinese most favored nation trading status and extraterritoriality rights, much like we'd seen happen in China. Only in Japan, Emperor Mutashito, who becomes known as the Meiji or Enlightened Emperor, and his rule as the Enlightened Rule, uh, almost immediately recognizes that, okay, we need to do something, and we can't hold back. We have to do sweeping changes, and so this becomes a turning point in modern Japanese history. And in the next 44 years, Meiji reformers are going to transform. I mean, it is in a couple decades they go from medieval Europe to modern Europe. They go through 400 years plus of change in 40. It's pretty amazing to think about. Um, they're gonna do this all with the imperial rule as kind of their power, but in reality, these shoguns, these leaders, are gonna kind of turn into an oligarchy. We'll see that shift. Um, but the emperor is going to remain a figurehead, and all the power of the government will still come through him. Even through World War II, that's going to be true. Um, and so really their difference, the major difference is in their attitude. They're not going to reject the West, but they're going to learn from Westerners and in order to beat them at their own game. They're going to look at what Westerners do, and they're going to say, okay, and literally going to study them, and say, okay, here's what they do well, here's what they do poorly. So they send out envoys to do that, and they're going to modernize by selecting what they want to use. So we'll see more of this, but it's selective borrowing, is what we call it. Famously, the Iwakura mission from 1871 to 1872 goes out, and you notice they're dressing like Westerners, not like traditional Japanese. You don't need to write this slide, but the purpose is to convince Japan to convince the West that Japan is different. They don't want to deal with these unequal treaties, and they look at, okay, why is the West more powerful than us? And they break it down, and they say, okay, how did they get there? What do they have that we don't? And they break that down as well. And so they come back and they really take what they want. They reject the idea that religion and individualism are key to growth. They instead emphasize the importance of hard work, planning, organization, and management. Very Japanese of them. They translate Western texts and bring them back to Japan and really commit themselves to education. All right, so this is a German view of the Iwakura mission, but if we look at all these reforms, they get rid of the feudal system. They redistribute the land so that merchants can have land to use. They update their Western education system, base it on the French and German systems. They're going to modernize the army, based on the German army. They're going to build a modern navy and base it on the British Navy. The focus on the emperor becomes intensified, which will be a problem down the road, although it will be an advantage at the end of World War II. You see more religious freedom, which is a modernization, and we have now a written constitution based on the German constitution and a modern banking system, which allows them to be a capitalist merchant nation. You may notice a lot of German in there, and that's because the Prince Ito is very much enamored with the German way of doing things, very cold and calculating, and win at all cost type attitude. That's where we'll leave off for now.